Hi, everyone. We'll get started in a few seconds, I think. Actually, let's just get started because we do have quite a lot we want to get through today. But thank you, everyone, so much for joining us for this 1-hour webinar on emerging trends and best practice in CSRD-aligned reporting. And a special thanks to those of you in the UK who could be outside enjoying the weather. So thank you. But your speakers today, so there's two of us on the line. We've got Eleonora Poisi, who's our Director of Reporting, and I'm Nicola Ledsham. I'm an Associate Director in our Sustainability Advisory team. And for those of you who don't know us, Salter Baxter is a full end-to-end creative sustainability consultancy. We're part of Publicis Group, so we're very much part of a global network. And we've been working with companies of all different sizes across different sectors for 25 years on materiality, strategy creation and evolution, stakeholder engagement and consumer activation, and sustainability and corporate reporting. And on the latter, we work with companies from across the UK, US, and Europe, helping them to develop reports that are aligned with mandatory and voluntary reporting standards. And obviously, over the last few years, CSRD has very much been in the spotlight. And through our blended team of consultants, creatives, strategists, and designers, we create an approach that actively avoids greenwash. So making sure that all of our strategies are credible and they have meaningful actions to back them up, but also on the other end of the spectrum that they avoid greywash. So making sure that the strategies don't just sit in a PowerPoint, that they really challenge, engage audiences and drive actions. So in terms of what we want to cover in the next hour, specifically, we want to provide a brief overview of CSRD and the end-to-end process. We want to share some of our learnings on double materiality and also how companies should prepare for CSRD implementation. So we have actually done an internal review of around 25 reports that are coming through from early adopters. So those companies that have voluntarily chosen to publish fully or partially in accordance with CSRD. So throughout our presentation, we've built in some stats and some examples of what we're seeing in the landscape. And all of those companies very much get an A for effort from us, but obviously voluntarily taking on the challenge and really leading the charge on CSRD-aligned reporting amongst a lack of guidance, which we'll come on to in a moment. We'll try to leave time for a Q&A at the end, so please do share questions through the Q&A function that you should have at the bottom as we move through. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Eleonora she's going to provide us with a brief overview of CSRD.
Thank you, Nicola. Hello, everyone. I'm not sure about everyone on the webinar, but I do feel that there is always a new sustainability regulations coming up by the EU Commissions. So it's great for sustainability consultants like ourselves, but we do appreciate that individuals working within the companies like yourself are finding it quite difficult to keep a finger on the pulse while continuing to carry out your jobs. It is definitely a very crowded regulatory space with various regulations feeding into each other. And CSRD is an opportunity for companies to take stock of what they are doing to align with the regulations expectations and also drive business transformation while meeting reporting compliance. So companies reporting on sustainability is quite important at the moment. And also it is an opportunity to demonstrate how sustainability is integrated into different aspects of the business. And it's really important for us to showcase that in also the next few slides. So one thing that we wanted to highlight is very overwhelming, but you should not be panicking because there's a lot of guidance that is being published by IFREG, and also there's a lot of support by different entities. So one thing that we wanted to highlight is that recently IFREG has published a new guidance on double materiality and value chain. So if you haven't had the chance to look at this, please have a look as well. So in terms of CSRD as an end-to-end process, there are 5 key steps in CSRD process that we would like to highlight. The first is the scoping, so understanding how you and your subsidiaries are in scope and what do you need to report. Secondly, understand the material ESG topics for your company through exploring the perspective of impact and financial materiality, identifying which ESG topics to invest in and work towards. Thirdly, undertaking a data readiness assessment to understand the data you have to report on for CSRD compliance. So identify any gaps and the quality of your existing data and set the parameters which will be useful when reporting on the accounting policies. Then moving on to implementation, including closing the data gaps, upskilling colleagues on the new reporting requirements, and updating on internal processes and controls. And finally, you can move on to CSRD reporting, building on the recommendation for your next reporting cycle. All right, so we're going to launch a poll. So 1 second. There you go. So
That's
hopefully you can all see the poll.
Should we give it a few more seconds?
Yes, 2 more seconds for we have a few more that can. Okay, so we have a few different responses. So a few of you have not started yet. So we can talk a little bit about how we can help you. There's a lot of companies that are still working on the upfront scoping, and they're in the process of double materiality assessment. So a few companies are now carrying out the data readiness assessment and implementation. So they're a little bit farther down the line as developing a CSRD-aligned reporting.
Great. But most of you then are in the double materiality assessment process, which is timely. So I'm going to spend a bit of time now taking you through some of our learnings. And as Eleanor has mentioned, I mean, double materiality is very much one of kind of the first essential steps towards CSRD compliance. Just to give a really quick recap, I'm sure all of you are very much aware of double materiality, but it's based on the recognition that a company's impact on the world can be material beyond purely financial considerations, and that they should be disclosed for reasons other than the effect on a company's bottom line. So it considers these two perspectives, impacts and financial materiality. So impact materiality considers impacts on people and or the environment connected to the undertaking's own operations, and also their upstream and downstream value chain, so including through its products and services, as well as through its business relationships. And then in contrast, financial materiality focuses in on the effects of sustainability matters on the undertaking's cash flows, financial performance, access to finance, or cost of capital in the short, medium, or long term. And really important to note upfront that a sustainability topic can be material from an impact perspective only, from a financial perspective only, or from both perspectives. So through reviewing the various bits of guidance coming out through EFRAG and ESRS, and working on a number of double materiality assessments over the last few months, and having conversations with our clients, we've kind of distilled down to 6 key learnings we really want to take you through today. Obviously, we realise there is so much more that we could cover, but what we're hoping to do today is provide you with some practical takeaways that you can consider as you move through your own double materiality processes. And before I take you through those learnings, we've just got another poll. I promise this is the last one. But yeah, we really want to understand the challenges that you face within your own companies as you've been working through double materiality, whether that's availability of data, leadership involvement, cost, budget, timelines, or all of the above. So I'll just give you a few seconds and would be really interested to see what comes through. I mean, everything has already got a vote, so I think that's unsurprising. Just give it a few more seconds. It's actually fairly evenly spread. Okay, let's close it there. So I think, not surprisingly, quality and availability of data is coming up on top. I mean, that's something that we have heard from our clients and also from others in this space. We've also got custom budget coming through. Again, not a surprise, the value chain complexity and also internal resourcing, and some of you opting for timelines as well. So yeah, thanks all for taking part. That's really helpful, and hopefully we can support you on this journey in the next 45 minutes or so. So we wanted to start by really emphasising the importance of taking the time upfront to set yourself up for success. So we've compiled a bit of a checklist to get you started. And for those of you who haven't started already, we really suggest that you kind of get ahead and start working your way through this list. So first of all, really making sure that you leave yourself plenty of time, and also really importantly, building the materiality timeline into your reporting schedule. So giving yourself sufficient time between completing the materiality and preparing your report. Double materiality is a complex, in-depth process, and so you are going to have to reserve substantially more time for a CSRD aligned double materiality than you would have done for the simpler assessments of old. So we typically recommend putting aside 5 to 6 months for completion, but obviously this will vary between companies. To ensure close collaboration, skipping one. We then really recommend tailoring the process you're undertaking. So ESRS doesn't actually mandate a specific process to follow when performing your assessment. It's very much left to the undertaking's judgment, and the process that you should use should reflect your business's facts and circumstances. So really taking the time up front and involving relevant functions to determine what that process looks like. And following on from that, to really ensure this kind of close collaboration and input between different group functions, we really recommend establishing a cross-functional working group up front so that you can really bring your internal stakeholders along with you throughout the process. It's this combination of different functions and skills. So for instance, strategy functions, risk, finance, procurement, and sustainability is really essential not only to meeting compliance requirements, but also to embedding sustainability into discussions about the company's operations and the business model. And then building on this, seeing as double materiality is a relatively new concept and it does require a kind of different way of thinking, we have found enormous value in providing capability building sessions on the CSRD and its requirements to the board, management and SMEs upfront. So this really helps to combat any misinformation or outdated information that stakeholders may have encountered in previous assessments, and it can also really support in getting buy-in early on in the materiality and the reporting process. Map your value chain. So the value chain is a really key element in the ESRS. So you need to capture impacts, risks and opportunities, or as we'll call them moving forwards, IROs, and where they occur upstream and downstream of the value chain. And we are still seeing some companies exclude topics on the basis that it's not material in their own operations or their direct contractual relationships. So to overcome this short-sightedness, we really recommend mapping your value chain and your different business relationships up front so that you can really keep this closely in mind throughout your assessment. And then finally, think ahead to your assurance. So ESRS requires companies to disclose their materiality assessment processes. So you'll need to be transparent about your process. So every aspect of your double materiality assessment should be documented to really provide a clear audit trail for your assurance partners. So, including your steps taken, any assumptions made, stakeholders interviewed, and key decisions made, and by who. So moving on to determining your thresholds. So thresholds are there to enable you to decide what to put in your report and what to leave out due to immateriality. So this is one of the least well understood parts under the guidance, which doesn't actually prescribe specific scales and thresholds. It does allow companies to define these for themselves. So I think understandably this has caused a fair amount of confusion, and that there actually wasn't any further clarity or guidance that came out in the final set of EFRAG guidance. So this does mean that we are seeing a huge amount of variation in the latest rounds of reports. Given that the CSRD aims to improve the quality and consistency of sustainability information, I think most of us would also argue that this lack of guidance really potentially puts these objectives at risk. So in the majority of reports that we've reviewed, companies either don't disclose the thresholds that they've used to determine their methodology, or they do at a really high level, but they don't justify this or provide an explanation as to how this was decided on. So within this, we are also seeing a mix of approaches. So quite a few companies are choosing arbitrary thresholds, so either capturing all topics that are above either a medium or significant importance threshold. And we're also seeing some aligning their financial materiality thresholds with existing ERM frameworks. But, most companies already do have this sort of pre-established definition of what a financially material issue is, but impact materiality then tends to be much less definitive and is potentially where the methodology falls down. So just as an example, we've got the company on the left here that only discloses 3 topics in the top right-hand corner as being material for the business, and they've got 14 they deem to be non-material, but they've not given accompanying justification as to how and why they've set their thresholds and how this decision was come to. And then beyond this, they've identified 8 topics that are material from an impact perspective, but they don't acknowledge these as being material to the business, and they then don't go on to disclose these topics in the report. So actually, they are kind of completely missing the point here, because as I mentioned earlier, topics that are considered to be material from an impact perspective need to be considered as material topics for the business. And actually, if we consider a longer time horizon, it's also really highly likely that these topics will eventually become financially material to the company anyway and move over into this top right-hand corner. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we are seeing companies kind of default to this view that everything is material as a result of setting lower thresholds. So, while this perhaps takes a more precautionary approach, if you say that everything is a material topic, then you kind of lose the real insight on what's truly material, and it potentially renders the whole exercise a waste of time. So there are issues with both of these approaches. Given the lack of guidance, I think our recommendation here is that careful judgment upfront is really needed, and finance and risk colleagues should be involved in these discussions really early on in your process. It can be helpful to consider financial materiality and impact materiality thresholds separately, because they are viewed differently. They're completely different perspectives. So you actually may find it's appropriate to set different thresholds for each. So perhaps taking inspiration from internal risk management processes for your financial materiality thresholds. And then in the case of impact materiality, using ongoing due diligence processes or other risk management processes to inform your thresholds. But I think, whatever you decide on at the moment, it's perhaps more important than anything to ensure that you've got the appropriate justifications to back this up, and really being sure to disclose on this in your reporting. Moving on to stakeholder engagement. So again, starting to see a bit of a running theme here, because the guidance on stakeholder engagement within ESRS isn't overly prescriptive, but I think overall we are really pleased to see that the objective of stakeholder engagement has shifted under double materiality. So, obviously stakeholders have always been central to materiality assessments, but we are now moving away from asking the usual suspects their perceived importance on sustainability topics, which I think we often found led to really incoherent results that tended to be skewed towards the agenda of those interviewed. And instead, we're seeking input and feedback to really understand the concerns and evidence regarding actual and potential impacts of the undertaking on people and the environment. So again, I just wanted to capture a few of the insights that we've learned so far. So yeah, first of all, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it's really taking the time up front to identify and prioritize and making sure that you build this into your process. Identifying the right stakeholders up front will really save you time in the long run. The ESRS defines two main stakeholder groups. So affected stakeholders, who are the people who are or could be affected by a company's activities and business relationships, and then also users of sustainability statements. So both stakeholder groups need to be really carefully considered and represented across your stakeholder engagement approach. So this is where the map of your value chain will come in really handy. So identifying affected stakeholders along the full length of the value chain and really making sure that you capture a representative set of voices. As part of this upfront process, we really encourage you as well to review your existing engagement mechanisms and identify the existing channels that you can leverage, as well as where there may be gaps that you might need to consider. So for instance, workers along the value chain might not have been engaged with previously, so how can you build them into your approach? But also we do obviously recognise that you need to be pragmatic here. It's not always going to be possible to speak to every affected stakeholder along the full length of your value chain. So we can also consider appropriate alternatives where needed. So for instance, consulting credible independent experts, such as perhaps an NGO representing a particular community, or conducting desk-based research. Secondly, so when it comes to developing your engagement methods, we always stress the importance of prioritising quality over quantity. And I think contrary to popular belief, sending out indiscriminate mass surveys far and wide isn't required anymore. And actually, I'm not convinced it was ever particularly helpful. So rather than trying to gather responses from hundreds of stakeholders who may not even understand what they're being asked or what the company is, we prefer to focus on collecting really high quality responses to drive our analysis. So for that reason, we like to put more emphasis on one-to-one interviews and focus groups to sort of gather those qualitative insights. And we're also really open to exploring alternative, more innovative approaches to engagement with our clients, such as, for instance, citizen assemblies. And when it does come to surveys, I think they're not always strictly necessary, but we do think that when done right, it can be a useful tool to reach a broader set of affected stakeholders. You just need to think really carefully about how you frame the question to ensure that you keep it as objective as possible. Thirdly, always leave room for strategic conversations. So by placing more emphasis on the quality of the qualitative and contextual insights, we're already in a much better place to be able to drill down to the so what and use the outcomes to deliver business useful decisions. But we really encourage you to build time into all of your engagements to keep an eye on the bigger picture, with room to discuss strategy, policies, and action plans related to the material matters. And then finally, stakeholder engagement is all too often, I think, reduced to reactive or sporadic outreach to meet the needs of a materiality assessment. So we like to encourage our clients to move away from one-off engagement to the establishment of kind of two-way ongoing communication channels, because not only will more meaningful long-term interactions cultivate stakeholder relationships and trust, but it really allows a company to gather more diverse perspectives, to anticipate potential challenges and really adapt to external changes more efficiently. So we probably could have had a whole webinar on stakeholder engagement, but I'll stop there. I think my main takeaway on stakeholder engagement is to really take your time up front, develop your strategy, and make sure that you have the right expertise to give you the right inputs as you move through the assessment. So when it comes to assessing and determining the materiality of your IROs, you need to apply objective criteria for assessing impact and financial materiality. So for impact materiality, you apply the criteria for severity, which is made up of the scale, scope, and irremediable character of the impacts. And for potential impacts, we also need to consider the likelihood of the impact occurring and map it across relevant time horizons. And then for financial materiality, we're assessing sustainability risks and opportunities based on their likelihood of occurrence and the potential magnitude of their financial effects in the short, medium, and long term. And when it comes to setting your exact scoring criteria, we would use EFRAG's implementation guidance as a starting point, but we found that the scoring system really needs to be adapted to fit the company. So taking into consideration the differences in company structures, business models, enterprise risk management processes, and also sustainability maturity. And this as well is where the process gets so much more granular. So one question that does come up consistently in our conversations is this balance between qualitative and quantitative scoring, particularly when it comes to the financial materiality element. So hopefully we can just provide a little bit of clarity and reassurance here, because the EFRAG guidance recognises that quantitative information isn't always possible, and actually qualitative information can often be valuable in informing the materiality assessment in its own right, because it also incorporates the information that you've gathered from your affected stakeholders. So whenever a qualitative analysis is sufficient to reasonably conclude that a topic is material or not, additional quantitative information wouldn't necessarily add anything to the assessment. In the longer term, of course, when models become more advanced, of course, we'll be able to integrate more quantitative outcomes. But I think until then, qualitative assessments are more than sufficient, and then backed up by quantitative information where available. Right, I'm worried this might be a controversial one. So a matrix has always often been the default in visualizing materiality. We are so used to seeing a materiality matrix in a report, so it's kind of just accepted as the status quo. So I don't know, this might be an unpopular opinion, but I think at Salter Baxter, we are very much of the opinion that a matrix can be misleading for a number of reasons. First of all, it's actually not required by reporting requirements anymore. So, GRI has done away with the matrix, and there's no mention of a matrix or actually any visual in ESRS. But most importantly here, it conflates impact and financial materiality. But actually, it's kind of like comparing apples to oranges, seeing as they're both assessed differently and they have different scoring thresholds. We also think that emerging topics are often overlooked if they're not yet relevant or not in that top right-hand corner of the matrix. And actually, I think behavioural science has shown that when we are put in front of a matrix, we are typically hardwired to look at that top right-hand corner, ignore the rest of it. So all in all, I think, the traditional materiality matrix format can potentially undermine a holistic and resilience-orientated approach. So when we look to see what the early adopters are doing in the space, we aren't surprised to see a much greater mix of visuals starting to emerge. So we've got a mix of butterfly charts to value chain diagrams to lists and tables. But the matrix does still take the largest share of the pie. Obviously, it's early days, and I think with the lack of guidance, it's not perhaps surprising to see that companies are sticking with what's familiar. But we do think it's time for a new approach, and we're really excited to see some interesting alternatives starting to come through. So just to give you a few examples of what else is out there, we've got a butterfly diagram on the left, which we like because it shows the nuance between impact and financial materiality, and it also nicely maps the ESRS topic standards against its material topics. I sometimes find butterfly diagrams a little bit difficult to read and interpret, so I think caution just needs to be taken there. And then on the right, we've got perhaps a more simplified view of topics identified as being impact material, financial material, and double material in a Venn diagram. And we've still got an element here as well of topic prioritization with the most material topics right at the top. And then another couple of examples, there's absolutely nothing wrong with a simple table that gets across the key information. So on the left, we've got the ESRS topics listed and whether they're material or not from an impact and financial perspective, and they've also been linked to the relevant sustainability pillar on the right. And then the company on the right, again, has taken kind of more of a tabular format, but they've mapped their topics across the value chain, and they've identified where in the value chain there are drivers of positive and negative impact. And this also goes to the next level of detail as well, because they've listed out the specific negative and positive impacts on the right, and they've marked these up on the value chain with the use of numbers and letters. So the level of detail is great, but I think potentially it does make it difficult to read. So I'm not saying that any of these are necessarily right or wrong. I think there's definitely not going to be a one size fits all solution, but it is really great to see companies turn the matrix on its head, and I'm sure we're going to start seeing a lot more of it. But just saying our key takeaway and point of view is that given the number of different parameters that you review as part of double materiality, it's not advisable or perhaps even possible to try to consolidate everything into one visual. So we really encourage you to keep these visuals simple so stakeholders can really quickly see what's been determined as being material to the company. And then instead of trying to convey everything in a single visual, you might need to move towards a suite of supporting visuals, and you'll also need to support any visual with engaging copy and a clear narrative as well. So my final point is really stressing the importance of viewing double materiality as a transformational tool. Obviously, it's an investment, both in terms of resources and cost. So it is really a missed opportunity if the outputs are then only used for compliance and reporting purposes. I think obviously given the scale of the immediate task at hand, the requirements can obviously seem daunting. So it's no surprise that companies do fall into this trap. But the level of disaggregation required in the process really does provide you with so many more sort of granular data points than your traditional materiality, and they can really help to drive deeper strategic insights. So, when we reframe materiality as a strategic transformational tool, it can help businesses to identify blind spots and disruptive risks, so both inside and outside of their direct control, and allow better management of risks that may become more significant in the future. It can help to evolve and develop future fit sustainability strategies. So really making sure that the strategy closely aligns with your business objectives and meets stakeholder expectations. It can drive innovation and differentiation, so identifying new markets and customer segments that prioritize sustainability and create opportunities for innovation. You can prioritize investments and resource allocation on your sustainability initiatives that are really going to address your most material issues and maximize your impact as a company. And then finally, it really helps to break down internal silos and build capacity across teams and embedding sustainability across functions, so from finance to strategy to legal. I'm going to leave you with this message. I think very few early adopters, and this example on the right is an exception, have started to report on the opportunities that they've identified throughout their materiality assessment. And instead, we're seeing them focus much more on their identified risks and impacts. So I think, again, this is just more evidence of the compliance mindset coming through. So, just ending on this point here is a reminder to not forget to report on your strategic opportunities. On that note, I'll stop speaking and I'm going to hand over to Eleonora, who's going to talk you through preparation for CSRD implementation.
Thank you, Nicola. So for the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to dive into a little bit more detail on the data readiness assessment, implementation, and CSRD report. As a first step for those people that have not yet started on their CSRD journey, we recommend carrying out a gap analysis to get a sense of what qualitative and quantitative information you have publicly disclosed, the detail of that information that is requested by each disclosure requirement, and assess the quality of the gap. Once that is done, we recommend engaging directly with the subject matter expert to gather further insight into those disclosures that will be required to be reported on that have not yet been disclosed publicly, and really assess the consistency of the methodology and assumptions to collect that information. This is key, especially because obviously the report is going to be audited, and it would be very important to set the foundation at the beginning of this process, especially to align with the accounting policies that companies will have to report on. On the next slide, we wanted to provide a little bit more of insight into what are the steps we will recommend in terms of the data readiness. So regulators are pushing for sustainability information to be investor ready. So it has to be consistent, comparable, and it is expected to have the same quality as financial reporting data. And one thing that is really important to bear in mind is as companies continue to grow through merger and acquisition, data collection becomes exceptionally difficult to collect and ensure comparability due to the different systems in place, as well as local regulations, methodology, and assumptions. So here are some consideration to start with. So first of all is understand the data you have with the readiness assessment, and possibly also consider the phase-in of disclosure, so you can prioritize which disclosure to start thinking about for your next reporting cycle. Assess how good the quality and accuracy of the data is. So like we mentioned, methodology and assumption use, and embed controls such as approval flows to your system and data platform is extremely fundamental for this stage of the preparation to CSRD alignment reporting. Another aspect is skills and expertise. So really get a sense of the core skills needed across the team and beyond, who has them and where the investment is needed. One thing to bear in mind is that the role of the sustainability reporting team has never been so important to set the foundation for future compliance. However, we want to emphasize that the work should not be all on your shoulders. So we do recommend considering acquiring or developing data collection, consolidation, and reporting system to ensure that you have everything in one place, and also engage with the internal controls team to understand the robustness of the processes that have in place and ensure that that is the same as you will have to collect the sustainability information. And in order to do so, there are some internal governance processes that ought to be considered. So these are some questions to help develop a little bit more of an internal setup to ensure that you have some sort of foundations to get people involved into the process. So for instance, which functions need to be involved and when, who is the data processor and the data owner, because sometimes these are different, and who can you engage with, how you can engage with leadership to identify how CSRD can be used to drive conversation around how sustainability can be considered in principal decisions at the management level as well as the board level. If we had to summarize 4 approaches to sustainability governance, these are the sustainability as a ivory tower. So one sustainability team working on its own to embed and drive sustainability forward. Then we have the functional involvement. So the sustainability team working with key functions to embed and drive sustainability forward. And the execution is typically owned and driven by that function. While the best practice would be to move towards co-ownership and co-creation. This is extremely useful as part of CSRD. So there is a group-oriented approach with sustainability and function lead working closely together. And also the fundamental immersion. This is more the best practice or leading practice in terms of sustainability governance. So the accountability of sustainability sits within the business by merging some function to hardwire sustainability into the different aspect of the company, its structure, and the roles are more defined in that way. So in terms of what is required to be disclosed with regards to CSRD, we have ESRS 2, so these are the general disclosures. And also we have the EU legislation data points. So these are disclosure that are part of other EU regulations that need to be included in the report. And also, one thing to bear in mind is companies may disclose a brief explanation of the reason that certain topics are considered not material. However, in the case of climate change, if a company deem the topic not to be material, then there has to be quite a lot of detail to explain the rationale for the exclusion. So we have provided some examples to showcase how companies do that. So H&H has provided an explanation on why certain topics have been considered not material. The company mentioned that certain topics will become increasingly important, but there are several challenges that they're facing at the moment before they can provide a viable solution. So they don't consider this topic material at the moment. However, as Nicola said, it's really important to bear in mind that although the topics might be emerging, they still be considered material, and investors might ask for further information on the reason why those have not made the list of the material topic for the company. Another example, slightly different, is to highlight which material topics I consider material for each of the business units. So DSM, Finchmich, what they've done is they carried out a materiality assessment at the business unit level, and they supplemented it with input from the group. So what is really important to consider when it comes to reporting and what will need to be assured? So the compliance to ESRS, the double materiality assessment, compliance with the EU taxonomy, and also the obligation to tag information using the digital taxonomy. So I just wanted to dive a little bit more in detail around the assurance. So at the moment, there is a consultations with regards to the kind of assurance standards to be used for sustainability information. But based on the research that we have done, what is really interesting is that when it comes to sustainability information, all the companies that have assured that the data, they use the international standards on assurance engagement 3000. And I think companies will continue to use that until the drafted standards will be considered by the EU Commission. Another thing to bear in mind is that the digital taxonomy is also under consultation. So as part of the research, we've looked, like Nicola said, around 25 different companies. And for the purpose of the next few minutes, I just wanted to give a sense of what are the key findings, especially with regards to the structure of the report, disclosure material, IROs, value chain disclosure, and other reporting practices. So as part of our review, it's really interesting to see that 61% of the companies align to the structure set out by ESRS topics, so using the same wording. For those companies that do not report in alignment with the ESRS topic, they demonstrate this by either tagging the disclosure throughout the report or just mention it in the text. ABN AMRO have structured the report against the ESRS topics using the same language, while Ford, who has followed the proposed structure of the sustainability statement set out by the guidance, follow a slightly different approach to continue reporting against the material topics, and they use ESRS tagged throughout the report to help the reader identify the disclosure requirements. With regards to reporting impact, risk, and opportunities, almost 70% of the companies have provided detail of the IROs with regards to the material topics. Also, over half of the companies that disclose the IROs in the report provide further detail on the negative, positive, potential, and actual impact, while other companies just keep it very high level. So METSA, what they do is they disclose their associated impacts, risk, and opportunities, which they clearly link to the relevant subtopics. For impacts, they disclose whether they are positive, negative, or neutral, and they disclose the specific nature of the risk and opportunity. So for instance, if they are market or regulatory related risk. And within each sections, they also provide detail on the sustainability commitments and targets. Ørsted addresses whether the material topic is considered a positive or negative impact, a risk or an opportunity, and provide detail on the rationale. It also addresses whether the IROs reside within the value chain or its own operation. Then we have ENO, which provides detail on the material risk impacts, both positive and negative, and also the risk and opportunities. And it provides detail on the type of impact, so actual or potential, and the time horizon of this. Other companies provide that detail within the text, such as H&H, Brand, and Arla. ESRS 2 requires company to address whether the IROs sit within the value chain. And the research shows that 63 of the companies disclose whether the IROs may occur within the majority of them, addressing whether they are within the whole value chain, so each steps of the value chain, or they use broad categorization such as upstream, downstream, and own operation. So what we're seeing, this is an example that also Nicola has shown in the previous slide, is how Hydro disclosed the drivers of positive and potential negative impact across the value chain. Then we have Ørsted, which they have opted for a more visual approach to demonstrate whether whether its material sustainability related impact of risk occur across their full value chain, and more detail is then provided in each section of the report. Arla addresses the impact of the company within the text, while Ferrero showcases the impact score and its scope, whether upstream, own operation, and downstream. With regards to other reporting practices, we looked at anticipated financial impacts. So, for instance, what we've seen is that only 2 companies actually disclose information on the anticipated financial impact for all the material topics, while it is more common for companies to look at the financial impact for climate change. So what are we seeing here is that the companies discloses whether more investment is needed to provide solution. And for instance, in the space of resource use and circular economy, looking at different material alternatives may also increase raw material cost, and they address that in the report. Bow Offshore, what they do is that they provide detail on the anticipated financial effects, addressing the potential magnitude and financial impacts, which might be higher than $50 million with regards to oil spill. So they showcase that the insurance coverage for pollution, cleanup, and damage is considered as part of the liability and is in place for all the assets. Another thing that we looked at is uncertainty and estimates. So Arla addresses these in the report as part of the disclosure around the quantitative information. The company also disclosed that to minimize the risk of manual errors, they have implemented a comprehensive internal validation process at both site level and centrally. Another thing that we looked at is accounting policy. So companies are required to disclose that level of information, and we're seeing Ørsted doing that in the report alongside the quantitative data. With regards to ESRS alignment, Ford has included a data table at the back where CSRD related metrics are tagged. And next to each table, they provide explanation on the methodology and assumptions. At the back of the report, Arla addresses the progress towards compliance with CSRD requirements, and these are color-coded, and they link to the pages where more information resides. And finally, BW Offshore, what they do is they provide detail on whether the certain information has been omitted for the purpose of the report and the rationale behind it.
Right, thanks, Eleonora. That was a lot of detail, but really, really helpful to see lots of examples in this space. Just to round off with some final kind of takeaways from us before we go into a couple of questions. Again, and I've mentioned this now probably more than a couple of times, but do give yourself plenty of time to work through the process and start now if you haven't already. Establish your internal cross-functional working group from the start and engage with them throughout the process. Engage with stakeholders both internally and externally beyond the usual suspects and review your engagement strategy. So really prioritize those qualitative conversations over collecting reams and reams of data points. Ensure you have the right internal systems and processes in place. And then finally, just to re-emphasize the point again, don't lose sight of the strategic opportunities. So on that note, going over to a few questions, and I think we've had a couple through. Eleonora, there's one around the sector-specific standards. So do you want to take on that one?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So with regards to the sector-specific standards, these have been delayed until 2026. However, what is worth noting is that the delay of this topic or the sector standards does not mean there is a delay in CSRD reporting. So if a UK company has a subsidiaries in the EU which meets the criteria for a large company, they will have to report on CSRD for fiscal year 2025.
Great. And there's another one as well around the number of stakeholders that need to be involved as part of your materiality process. I can take that one on. So there's not kind of a critical mass or a minimum number of stakeholders that need to be engaged as part of the process according to the guidelines. So I think really determining the adequate number of stakeholders is very much dependent on a variety of different factors. So considering the size of the organization, the complexity of your value chain, and also, resources available to conduct a double materiality. So you can be pragmatic as needed as well, as I mentioned. So if you can't reach all stakeholder groups, then you can use desk-based research and conversations with relevant internal stakeholders as a proxy. I've just seen, Eleonora, there's another one come through around GRI standards not being used anymore.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So with regards to the GRI standards, we are seeing still companies continuing to report on it, but having discussion with other companies, it seems like they're going to be dropped by certain companies, mainly because there's a lot of interoperability between the two standards, so ESRS and GRI, and moving towards CSRD, a lot of the data points that are required by GRI will have to be adopted anyway. So a lot of companies might decide not to continue with GRI.
Great. And another one coming through around if you should report on inherent or residual risks. So yeah, that's a tricky one. So actually, I think the CSRD guidance states that you should disclose on your outward impacts before you've managed them. So essentially that's the inherent risk that becomes the measure. It is less clear on the financial materiality, so companies do have a bit more leeway to play with. So we do see value in both. I think we tend to consider the inherent risk when we score for magnitude, but when considering the likelihood of those risks and the opportunities occurring, we will then consider the controls and the measures that a company has in place. So I think, as an example, one that we see coming through is business conduct. So I think, if there was a potential incident surrounding compliance or corruption, then obviously this would pose a significant risk to the business. But actually, when you take into consideration the undertaking's controls and their track record on compliance and anti-corruption, the likelihood of this actually happening is so low that it wouldn't necessarily be determined to be financially material.
I think we also have a question around time horizons and whether they will have to be reported on in terms of material topics, only reporting in the short term. I don't know, Nicola, if you want to.
Yeah, of course, I can take that. So ESRS sets out that you need to consider your IROs across the short, medium, and long term. So long term's 5 years plus. I think short term is 1 year, and I think medium is 3 to 5 years. Eleonora, do you know from the top of your head? I think that's right. But there is also an option to select entity-specific time horizons as well for your medium and long-term time horizons. So I think we would always recommend that you align with the time horizons that you consider internally. So what we would do is for each of the IROs, we determine on which time horizon it will likely occur. So for instance, if it's occurring now or if it's likely to take place in the next sort of 3 to 5 years. And we also consider as well how the sustainability matters are likely to evolve over the medium and long-term view. So this is based on a combination of desk-based research and stakeholder engagement. But this is also where we can start to identify those sort of disruptive risks that may be coming through that previously might not have been considered by the business.
Okay, there is a question around the governance aspect of CSRD. So whether there should be someone responsible and accountable and which function should be. It really depends on the business structure, but there should be definitely overall accountability and responsibility with regards to CSRD. One thing that we would suggest doing is having the finance team to be very involved. And with the conversation that we had with some companies, we're seeing the CFOs to being quite involved with regards to CSRD. So while I would suggest to the sustainability team and reporting team to drive it, I think it should be a co-ownership with the finance team and get other people involved within the business.
Great. I think that's all the questions. So with 3 minutes to go, I think we can close off there. But obviously, we are always happy to have more conversations. So if you do have any follow-on questions, please do get in touch with either of us. We've put our contact details up here. We're always happy to discuss anything double materiality or CSRD. So please get in touch. But otherwise, thank you to everyone for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your days.